discuss this important topic. Margaret's been very kind to me on a number of occasions and supported me in a number of initiatives here in the Brisbane campus where we're broadcasting from today. So I'm very excited to have her here as our discipline chair nationally. Yeah, so it's a real pleasure and a real treat for us here at ACAP, the industry alumni team, to have Margaret here to present this topic for you today. And I'll hand over to her, being the expert, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Will. And I'm really thrilled to be here and appreciate for so many of you at the end of a long day coming and participating, or for many of you who will listen to the recording later. But just as part of our process and our protocol, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, to water and to culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We recognise those whose ongoing efforts to protect and promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures will leave a lasting legacy for future leaders and elders. Well, tonight, as we were planning, we've identified a number of areas to explore in this space of cyber safety. And what I'd like you to do is, we've identified we're going to have a little bit of a look at the new stats, the most recent statistics that are looking at how many people are engaging in the internet here within Australia and worldwide. We're going to burrow a little bit further, and we're going to look at defining what does this term cyberbullying mean. And it'll be really interesting because I'm going to get you to do some thinking and some working as we go through that process. Based on definitions of cyberbullying, we then look at risks. And you might find in the school setting or in the higher education setting or even in the workplace setting, the statistics may vary quite substantially. And that is often because the definition is not an agreed definition. So I'll talk with you about that and explore a little bit of that, because that's really very important. That's foundational to what we're talking about when we're really wanting to build resilience for young people in staying safe online. We're going to look at consequences of cyberbullying, and some of the consequences that we read about and we see in the media are there right in front of us, but there's a lot of other consequences to be aware of. And I think with us moving through 2020, it was such a challenging year, and online became our friend. Whether you were somebody who was connected to social media or not, whether you even knew what Zoom was or a Zoom meeting, it's now become part of our everyday life. And so life has actually launched us into this space. And so even more important that we are aware and we're taking precautions and we're proactive in terms of being safe in the cyber land. We're going to look at potential predictors of individuals who engage in inappropriate behaviour in online. And tonight I'll use the word bullies. A lot of the literature talks about perpetrators. I might talk also about individuals who engage in power over. But I'm talking about individuals who choose to use power over others in a derogatory way and creating an unsafe space for those on the receiving end. We're going to explore information that will be some tips for you, some practical strategies, and hopefully as I'm chatting through, you'll be going, yes, 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 yes. Those are strategies I'm already adopting. And some of the other strategies might be ones that you think, that's one I'm aware of, but I actually haven't ventured. I haven't been rigorous enough in terms of that particular strategy. Because I can remember years and years and years ago when I started exploring this world of cyber safety, which would be probably over 20 years ago, but particularly became prominent to me when I worked in Asia, when I worked in Singapore at a higher education institute there. And many of the international students would say to me that they felt very uncomfortable coming into the classroom because they were worried if there was a peer in that classroom who actually was engaging in negative behaviour in social media. On the flip side of that, I also had many of the students in the higher education space and in schools who'd often say to me, I need to dress right because someone might take a picture on Instagram, etc. So I've got to really dress for the day. And this would have been over 20 years ago. And so the changes that have happened and the strategies that we've adopted, we see something magnificent with the E-Commissioner here in Australia, really prominent, very important. And if you aren't familiar, take time, get yourself a glass of wine, glass of water, an orange juice, a tea or a coffee, and really start to make that website your friend, because there's so much there. There's a lot there for parents. There's a lot there for teachers. There's a lot there for community and workplaces. And it's not about reinventing what's there. It's about, it's well researched, it's well documented. And we'll refer to a little bit of that tonight. And we're also going to spend time, and believe it or not, this is all going to be in our time frame. We are going to spend time, and I'm going to share with you some of the research I've been involved in recently with a team of researchers in Singapore and Australia. And we've been looking at the literature and the research in terms of youth, adolescence, and cyber safety, and lots of the strategies that we as parents often might suggest, or as teachers we suggest to adolescents. And I often suggest those strategies as well to adolescents here in higher education, but our research is saying that many of them aren't buying in. They find it very difficult to disconnect, that fear of missing out. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well, and we'll talk about hopefully we'll make this relevant for you. So you're all coming with a base of information. I know that all of you have information and knowledge, and maybe incredibly expert in this area of cyberbullying. And so tonight for you might be an affirmation of yes, 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 I'm on track. For others, it might be a research, a refresh and a revisit. So I ask you to be open, and I ask you to consider what we're talking about, and just in terms of be kind to yourself, relax and think about, yes, I'm on track, or this is something to consider, or perhaps I'm interested in some of that research. So tonight I'm going to talk about researchers say, or practitioners say, or we say. If there's different things I talk about and you're interested in reading an article, whether it's in schools or higher education, workplace, etc., just email and I'm happy to send that out over the next week. So by way of beginning, I'd like you just to jot on your phone, down on your phone or on a piece of paper, two things that you know about cyber safety in the teaching and learning space. So two things that you're very conscious of. In fact, tonight, when I was coming down the steps from we've got classrooms on the second floor, the third floor, and the first floor on our campus here in Brisbane in a building. And on the second floor, 4 of our educators are actually teaching online tonight. They've got classes across Australia. So they've got students who might be in the Northern Territory, Tasmania, Adelaide, Brisbane, Melbourne in their class. And it was interesting, as I happened to be just walking in their vicinity as they were setting up the class for tonight, all of them individually talked about the netiquette of online behaviour and what's negotiable and what's not negotiable in terms of how we interact with one another in Zoom, in discussion forums, on the chat room. So what heartened me is that for our staff here, they're not assuming that their students have the same picture and the same understanding of how we behave in an online space. And these are grown-ups talking to grown-ups. And it's critical that we never lapse into this sense of, oh, she'll be right, mate. They'll know. They should know this already. Because what we found in the research, in higher education, for example, we do have, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, a large percentage of individuals who are on the receiving end of bullying behaviour. And often those individuals have been bullied through primary school and they've been bullied through secondary school. And so we can't necessarily have the same interventions in a higher education setting that we have in a secondary setting, that we have in a primary setting, or in a preschool or an early years setting. So think about 2 things that you know and you're absolutely certain about in terms of cyber safety in relation to the themes. I'm going to put it back here, the themes that we've got here. So, and then we'll just journey. I'll stop at different times and have a little bit of a conversation and ask you to ponder, ask you to consider, and then we'll keep going. So what we've got here, as I was putting up there, and Will and I were actually having a conversation about this just before we started, looking at the percentage of when we look at Australia, the statistics are actually showing us Australia is part of Oceania, 29 million people who are actually internet users in that particular region. And I think if we looked, and this is 2020, so it's interesting results that have come through saying there is a significant number of individuals within our own backyard, ourselves included, who are walking in this territory. Now, don't get me wrong. I think working in the cyber world, being able to connect with others online is just brilliant. Having lived in so many places myself around the world, to be able to be on my family's kitchen bench, on the kitchen table, as we share a meal together, or as I'm ironing or we're listening to music, has made an enormous difference to my well-being and to a sense of connectedness and cohesiveness. So there is so much to celebrate in terms of online engagement. It's about us being proactive. It's about us being conscious. Are we engaging positively? Are we acting appropriately? And it might be, yes, we are. Our family members, how we support our family members, our students, whether they're 5 years of age or whether they're 55 years of age. It's looking at parameters. And some of you who are listening tonight as parents or grandparents, aunts or uncles might be smiling to yourself in terms of some of the conversations you would have had with your own family, with youngsters who are, kindergarten, prep and preschool. With COVID happening, everything went online. And all of a sudden, these youngsters are being exposed to online engagements, online apps, doing all sorts of things. And how do you balance that in terms of the lifestyle of online, but actually getting out there and kicking a football, having a little bit of a run, going treasure hunting? So getting that balance, because the research is showing us that many individuals who choose to engage in cyberbullying behaviour are individuals who haven't got that balance right. Their online world becomes quite predominant. And so the leisure activities, the social connected activities, doing things away from the internet without feeling as though you can't walk anywhere without it being magnetized to you is problematic. So as I'm talking tonight, think about what you model to those you're teaching, to individuals you may be working with, and to family members as well. So just this in terms of the stats, and you'll see it's very interesting in terms of Australia being part of Oceania. We have a significant high number of individuals engaging in this online space. So for us, it's thinking, yep, there's a lot of positives in terms of engaging in the online space, and we know that, but there's also the conundrum of the potential to be exposed to inappropriate behaviour. And that's what we're going to concentrate on a little bit tonight and actually have a look at that as we discuss. So in terms of, there has been a rapid uptake and advancement of the internet, and obviously the magnificent thing about that is the international flow of knowledge. There's also the fact that for schools and higher ed institutions, that's resulted in us developing lots of apps, different software, so we actually can deliver content in our teaching and learning space in an efficient and an effective and a quality way. And I know last year with COVID, in March here at ACAP, for example, we had close to 2 weeks to move all of our classes that were on campus into the online space. And we had students who traditionally had always voted with their feet and said, I'm an on-campus student. And we had staff who said, choose me for on-campus. Well, we were in a situation where we didn't have that choice, with the government setting out the regulations in terms of what was happening in different states. And so we, like yourselves, moved so rapidly into the online space. Schools, I know we've got family members, and I had youngsters in prep who in my family, great nephews and nieces who were doing online learning, and others doing their final year of school, where they spent the year at home virtually doing schooling, and others who did their university qualifications actually studying online. So if we didn't have this incredible internet, we would have been quite stuck in terms of what are we actually going to do? We can't put a brake on and say, well, we can't go on campus, we can't go to school, we can't actually engage. What are we going to do? We had so much there, but our big challenge was, how do we move into that online space, and how do we grow, how do we nurture, how do we develop our students and our staff so that they are going with us, and so that students are aware of it is a different space working online than working in a classroom. There's behaviour expectations. One of the things for us, I lead the counselling discipline here at ACAP. And one of the things that we've spent a lot of time talking with the staff and our students is that in the online space, we need to keep our camera on. If you've got internet concerns or there's religious concerns where it's not appropriate, that's a different conversation. But we want you to be meaningfully engaged. And the challenge of how do we meaningfully engage our students in a way that's respectful and courteous. And also, when we look at chats and we look at blogs, we look at forums, how do we talk in that space in a way that is respectful? It's great to have viewpoints different from our own, but it's the way we communicate that. And when I explore a little bit more and I talk to you about this whole definition of what bullying is in the online space, I want you to think about having an opinion, being able to communicate that opinion, but communicating that in an appropriate way. Now, my vision of appropriate might be different from yours, might be different from Will's, might be different from Megan's. And so we need to actually have a shared understanding and not assume that everybody in our family, in our classroom, has the same understanding. And so we come from different generations, but it's not about a generational difference. It's about a shared language and really understanding and what's okay and what's not okay. And we need to be very clear in cyber safety land, what's okay and what's not okay. I take you back to the conversation that I heard as I was coming down to do the talk, our educators upstairs being very clear in their conversations with their students about, as our community of learning, we're going to grow and we're going to work together for 13 weeks. And let's start to talk about our codes of engagement. So they're not assuming that. So think about, for many of you who are teachers in classrooms, how much time have you invested in actually setting up appropriate behaviours for students? So often in a physical classroom, we spend our first week doing that, and we spend a lot of our time infiltrating our curriculum in terms of what's appropriate, not appropriate. For example, for teachers, it might be speak to please, not to tease, listening is learning, some of the different mantras that we have, but we unpack them. So how many of us have actually taken the time and said, oh, I'm in a different landscape now. How do I transfer these behaviours and these codes into the online teaching and learning? Because our big challenge as educators is we want our students to be meaningfully engaged. We want them to fly with their own wings. And for us as educators, we need to set up the environment. We are lead managers, and we need to create and design the learning space so it becomes a community of learners. It's not my expectation or Will's expectation, it's ours. So one of the strategies we'll revisit towards the end of how we create a safe space is really making sure that students have buy-in to how we're going to work together. And the fact of being aggressive, being using power over, humiliating others, harassing others in an online space, that's a no-go zone. That's not on. So we need to be strong and we need to be courageous, but we need to communicate why it's not okay. It's not because I said. We need to investigate further. And I'm speaking to so many of you now who know this, who do this brilliantly. And hopefully this is just a refresher to say, yeah, Marg, that's right. Yep, I'm on track. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to start to describe what cyberbullying is in terms of the literature. So just as I start to embark on the conversation, I'd like you to jot down, whether on your phone or once again on pen or paper or in your mind, what's your understanding? How do you define cyberbullying? Because for us, we need to have a shared understanding, a shared language. So when I worked as a counsellor, working with schools, and I did a lot of work in terms of cyber safety behaviour with youngsters from the age of 3 to 18 years of age. And then obviously the last 13, 14 years working in higher education, I spent a lot of time with adults in terms of a shared understanding. So have a think about how you define cyberbullying. That's really important. So just jot down what you think. This is my definition of cyberbullying. So don't go and look at Mr. Google. Don't go and look at Ken Rigby's work. Don't go and look at the e-commissioners and jot it down. Just think, what do you intuitively know about what cyberbullying is? So that's my first challenge to you. So as you're doing that, I'm going to share with you a little bit about what the research is saying. And as I said earlier, I got so much research that I can share with you if you're interested. So let us know if you're interested. So let's begin the conversation. There are many researchers who say cyberbullying is a form of traditional bullying, but it has different phenomena and different features. So the features are like catfishing, mocking, trolling, sexting. So it's saying, well, it's the same, but because it's in a different landscape, it's in the online, it actually has different elements that's made up of it. So that's a really interesting generic definition. So there's a lot of researchers that probably over the last 15 years are swaying towards, well, it's a form of traditional bullying. No, don't get too comfortable, because you've got another school of researchers who are actually saying cyberbullying is straddling between traditional bullying, which is in person, like Will and I are here on the campus in Brisbane. So it's the face-to-face, in person. So there's a whole school of thought that says, well, it actually marries between traditional bullying and working in the online space. And it's a little bit seamless between the two. So depending on what you jotted down yourself in terms of how you define this construct, you'll be saying, yep, I think maybe that first school of thought, or yeah, maybe it's a combination of both. Now, in the second one where they say, well, it's a combination of online and traditional, they do actually say a couple of important things in this research, and it's interesting research, and it's research that I've been engaged in for over 12, 13 years. But in this one, it says there are two distinctive features. One is it's repetitive in nature, and it's intentional. So it's not just, I thought I was being funny and I did it once and I realized it did offend the other person, so I put the brakes on and chose my habits of engaging. It's the fact that, no, it is repetitive. Now, many years ago, the conversation was, it is repetitive because if you press the button and you say you like it, or you pass on what you see, it can go to another 100 viewers. It can go to 1,000 people. It can go, it's endless. And so there's always been this understanding that by the click of your finger, by passing something on, a like or a comment, you're actually witnessing something that's been put up by one person, and then you're repeating that to a cast of thousands. So there's that concept of, yeah, it's repetitive, but the school of thought that's saying it straddles between online and traditional is actually saying it's often done more than once. So individuals who engage and choose to use power over others are doing it more than once. It's a habit. It's a behavior habit. And what's interesting in this particular one, it's intentional. Now, if you look at the research that talks about traditional bullying, it's not always intentional. But here in the cyber world, this group is saying, well, it's intentional. And it's also about, and you think about, if you've ever been on the receiving end of someone who chooses power over behavior in the internet world, in the cyber world, it's often directed at someone who can't easily defend themselves. And that's a real challenge. And I think in the traditional world, often that happens, is that you'll pick somebody who may choose not to respond, who may choose to keep it all inside themselves, but they often are the vulnerable individuals, not necessarily the resilient individuals. And resilience is really critical when we talk about cyber safety, when we talk about leading a teaching and learning space with our students as educators, our own resilience, as well as how do we create that space? It's a safe space for students, and we are about sustaining resilience. The last thing any one of us want is a student to be engaged in our classroom, which is an online classroom, perhaps because of COVID, we've moved to online, or perhaps because that's how we're teaching and that's how our employers have dictated how we'll be teaching. The most important thing is every single person who is in that class deserves the respect, they deserve compassion, they deserve safety. So they're not there to be set up to feel vulnerable, to feel shame, to feel humiliation. And so one of the things that this second definition talks about, yep, it's got a bit of the traditional, but in the online space, it's the repetitiveness, it's the intentionality, it's choosing people who are far more vulnerable. And I guess in the research, we talk about, and I want you to have a think about this, we talk about it's a systemic abuse of power. So when I asked you very early on, I said, what do you know about cyberbullying? And then I upped the ante and said, jot down what you know in terms of the themes we're going to talk about. And not to be settled myself with that, I've given you another challenge to say, how would you define it? So think about some of these different constructs we're talking about. Now, I'm going to take us into a different landscape. So over the years, there's also a third school of thought. Some of you might belong to it. And this third school of thought is saying it is different from traditional bullying, inasmuch as it depends on the technological expertise of the individuals or groups who choose to use power over behaviour to the individuals who are on the receiving end. Another phrase for the individual on the receiving end is a victim. So it's about technological expertise. And a lot of the research is showing us that many individuals who engage in cyberbullying behaviour are really experts in this technology land. And for many of the individuals who are the recipients, not so. So that's something that's really interesting. So for teachers listening tonight, think about how do we upskill the students in our classrooms and what do we offer so that students can actually learn some of the tactics and some of the strategies so that they are able to switch off, they are able to move away, they are able to collect evidence. So if somebody is shaming them on a discussion forum, that they're able to collect that evidence and then pass that on. For us, it would be to a unit coordinator or a national educator. In the schools, it would be to a teacher, to a year level coordinator, pastoral coordinator, principal, etc. So what's interesting is that in this particular definition, they are strong and they say, well, it's different from traditional bullying. It depends to a degree on your technological know-how. You also have, in cyberbullying, you also have an interesting role with bystanders. So we talk about bystanders and upstanders. And at the end of the day, they're very similar. Bystanders are people who are on the periphery, they're observing what's happening, they're witnessing what's happening. And upstanders are people who are on the periphery, they're witnessing what's happening, but they also stand up and they say enough is enough. So there's a lot of research, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of school programs where we talk about peer mentoring, we talk about different ways of skilling individuals to be upstanders and to be bystanders. But I'm going to deflate that a little bit later in this conversation and share with you some of the research we found last year in the project I did with Singapore and Australia, looking at what was happening with schools and what we think is happening is actually not happening. So I'd be really heartened to hear from you. If you're in a school community where you are actually doing magnificent work with your bystanders and upstanders, and I'll be really interested to learn from you. And if you are interested, to partner with us and to do some research, because that's an area that's a weak link for us. We know that in the cyber world, it's probably more prominent than in the traditional world, but there isn't a significant amount of research behind it. So the big challenge, of course, and you'll probably say, Marg, this is a no-brainer, is that in the online world, we actually have a much bigger audience. So if you think about traditional bullying, it might be somebody in the bathroom, might be somebody out in the oval, it might be somebody in the corridor who's, engaging in that power over behaviour. A little bit about, for those of you who might have seen the movie Mean Girls, there's lots of examples of bullying behaviour within schools, etc. And so one of the things is it's very difficult to escape from it, but the audience, you've got an enormous audience. So in face-to-face land, you might have everybody who's walking down the corridor. You might have the two other people who happen to be in the cubicles when you're in the bathroom. You might have somebody who happens to be walking with you as a friendship group as one of your peers engages in bullying behaviour. In cyberbullying, the audience is unknown. And you think about some of the catastrophic results that have happened to some of the young people here in Australia because of what they have been on the receiving end and their choice, their fatal choices that they've made. And the cyberbullying has been one component. It's not the component, but it's been one component. So we say the big difference when you're looking at how do you define cyberbullying is you think about it has a audience. So its audience is far bigger. You've got bystanders who can click a button, who can intervene, who can pass it on as well. And the big thing that's different between cyberbullying and traditional bullying, and you've probably written this down already, is that cyberbullying is 24/7. You can't actually get away from it. Whereas traditional bullying, often at the end of the day, the youngster gets in the car or gets on the bus or the train or gets on their bicycle and they're heading to either an after-school job or they're heading home or they're heading to the park, and they can actually reinvent themselves and they can be a different person. They can just be who they are, and they haven't got this. But when you're cyberbullied and you've got a phone and you've got access to social media, those pings, and you are constantly on Facebook and you're looking and you're seeing the derogatory comments, you just can't get away from it. So it's really, really challenging. And so I think to consider when we talk about cyberbullying, now I've just given you probably three of the big schools of thinking about what cyberbullying is. And a lot of the research I've been involved in, and obviously you'd expect this, is we do actually need to define cyberbullying, because then if we're looking at the prevalence rates or how to create a safe learning space, teaching space, we've actually got to have a shared definition. But what I'm going to share with you is I'm just going to name some words. And I think from my experience, working with a number of people, and I'm certainly continuing to learn in this space, and that's why I was thrilled when Will suggested we do tonight, is to identify some really important pillars and see if they reflect on what you've written when we talk about definition of this construct. So for me, one is it's intentional. It's also repetitive. And I didn't use this word. This is probably the first time I've used it in the talk tonight. I've used the word abuse of power. And the literature talks about abuse of power, or it also talks about an act of aggression. So that's an important one, abuse of power slash act of aggression. It's carried out by an individual or a group of people. It's using technology, such as the mobile phone, such as internet, to systematically use power over another individual or a group of individuals. And I think the other element to me is it renders the individuals on the receiving end helpless. So many of these individuals have such beautiful strength and they're such magnificent individuals, but they often get a sense of believing what the cyberbullies are saying about themselves. So that vulnerability, they're fragile, that resilience that we talk about, starts to evaporate. And so for me, I think one of the things I've learned working with individuals who are bullies, working with bystanders, upstanders, working with individuals who are victims and school communities, is that it's the fact that an individual is kind of pushed into a corner. And I think that is because of the fact that they just get exhausted. It's that 24/7, the 24/7. You just don't get away from it. And I know with my family, I don't know if it's the same with yours, but I've got a lot of grown-ups in my family. And one of them many years ago, I think he's ahead of his time. And he said, this would have been about 16 years ago, he used to talk about having a digital-free weekend. And I used to think, wow, isn't that impressive? But now I found that the world's caught up with him. And there are more and more people who actually make a conscious choice of switching off, who make a conscious choice of disconnecting to a number of apps that they've been connected to before, simply because they just want to re-engage with life. They want to be around people that are life-giving, not life-draining, and they need to be able to get balance back in their life. So it's an interesting conversation. I encourage you tonight, if you've got family around or friends, or over the next week, to talk with colleagues about, are you connected? Have you stayed connected? How many of you are connected on LinkedIn? How many, which is a positive thing. We promote LinkedIn because it's a professional connection. But how many of you are connected on Facebook? I spoke today with 2 staff who said to me, I have disengaged from Facebook. I was finding, A, it was taking too much time, and B, the fact that it wasn't always positive. It was, there wasn't that cult of positivity. So we can't live in fairyland. Life is not fairyland, but it's about being respectful and about being courteous. And I think that that's, for us as human beings, the moment we forget about respect and courtesy, compassion and empathy, it's a real big concern in terms of ourselves, our relationship with others, and how we're actually going to interconnect in the world. And for those of you who are listening tonight, who are counsellors or who are going to be working in the counselling profession, respect is our bread and butter. We need to respect, and everything we do, how we speak with others, it's about mutual respect. It can't be one way, it's mutual respect. So what I've got up here on the screen is, over the years, when we talked about, and I talked about earlier, cyberbullying has lots of different elements. And so as you have a look here, we've got a website that I'm happy to send the link to. And we have a lot of young people over the last 9 years who have actually contributed to the website. And so all of these elements, they've actually done lots of really beautiful, short, sharp, punchy little videos that if you wanted to share it with your class, wanted to share it in your school, with your staff meeting, in higher education with your class, it's all open access. So it's there for you if you'd like it. But this is really interesting in terms of looking here. I can remember in 2012, and some of you might have been a lot younger at that point in time, and I'm sure I was a lot younger those many years ago. But when we were actually defining the elements of cyberbullying in a couple of big projects, believe it or not, sexting wasn't in there. And probably about 2014, it became into its own. And the E-Commissioner has a huge amount of valuable resources for young children and for youth and for adults in terms of how do we actually protect ourselves and how can we be proactive in this area. But if you have a look at a lot of these, it would be very interesting to have a conversation with a mate and just say to them, what's your understanding of, how many elements do you think comprises cyberbullying? So whilst we've had the conversation, it's kind of, what is the definition? And at the end of that conversation, I was saying, well, I think this, and this are probably pretty prominent. then think about what are the elements. Because for us to be able to create a shared space and to lead and manage a shared space, we've got to understand these elements. Because if we don't understand them, how can we gently guide somebody and teach them a different way of interacting? So someone might have a habit of behaving. I'm doing this. This is what I do. I always do what I've always done. So I'm always going to get what I've always got. So if we know we've got young people in our classrooms who are on the receiving end of some of these elements of behavior, we actually can then look at, well, how are we actually going to support them? If we're going to engage in behavior change with them and develop some plans and psychoeducation, I'll talk a little bit later in terms of even some of the counselling intervention that's recommended, we need to understand there are all of these elements. So I'm sure if I'd actually said to you, write down the elements that you know that comprises cyberbullying, you probably would have got a large number of these or even more. And what's exciting here is where we build on this. This is growing and this is developing this list. Exciting in terms of not exciting in terms of we're getting more bullies who are coming into this arena, so we found something else, but exciting that whilst we might have a difference in the definition of the construct, everybody's on the same page in terms of the elements. So when you think about your school, when you think about working with a client who may present to you in terms of a victim of bullying behavior, you're burrowing below the surface and really trying to identify what component is happening within this individual's world. And also when we're looking, you might be working with individuals who choose the bullying behavior. I know I've worked in lots of schools and I've worked with a lot of young people who have chosen this behavior. And then as a school community, how we work with everybody to get the sense of safety, the sense of trust, because that needs to be rebuilt for individuals to trust somebody else. And the difficulty we know with some of the interventions is that it's very clear to us as an adult, perhaps we don't stay addicted to our phone, but saying that to a young person that they've actually got to turn off their phone and we're going to schedule the time that they have on their phone, often that might be World War III because they're fearful of missing out. But then on the other side, if they're connected, they're going to be on the receiving end for this derogatory behavior. So in many ways, it's a conundrum. And so for many of us, because we've been on the planet longer than the students that we're teaching or the individuals that we're working with, we got a little bit more experience. So we really do have a commitment to see how do we grow and develop with our individuals with whom we work. So now I'm going to ask you, I'm just going to take a moment and I'm going to ask you to think about individuals or groups who engage in cyberbullying behavior in a teaching and learning landscape. What do you think might be their profile? So, you know, I know right at the very beginning tonight I referred to frequent internet use, but for many of you, you've been motivated to come on tonight or you're listening to the recording. So you have a buy-in and an interest, obviously, in cyber safety in the teaching and learning landscape. So what do you think influences individuals to choose power over aggressive, assertive behavior in a repetitive way to systematically humiliate others who are vulnerable and frail and unable to defend themselves in a sustained way? So think about, what do you identify when you look around you? What would be some of the profiles, some of the behavior traits, some of the characteristics of individuals who choose the power over behavior? So what I'll share with you is some of the information I know, and you've also got lived experience in terms of working in this space or working with others in this space or teaching, where the reality is when we look at the statistics in schools from the E-Commissioner, we're saying 1 in 5 of our students are actually impacted by bullying behaviour. And if you look at the work from Ken Rigby, he would reiterate that. The reason I refer to Ken is Ken has been around as an Australian researcher for decades in this landscape. So we know that the most common trait for persons engaging in bullying behaviour, cyberbullying behaviour, is frequent internet use. They often engage in the risky online behaviour. They have a sense of moral disengagement. And the moral disengagement is an interesting one in terms of hide behind the screen. And having a different rule of code of ethics. Their code of ethics online is very different from their code of ethics in the real world. And you might know individuals who are the most gracious, courteous, magnificent, generous individuals in an online space, but you might find that in a traditional space, their behaviour might be more of a power over, or vice versa. So for this one, we're saying moral disengagement, and that's really important. For those of you who are counsellors or teachers, school teachers working, or principals, coordinators, it's really important to think, okay, if I've got students who it is that moral disengagement, how do we bring back and infuse values? So you've got your school values, you've got your family values, but you've also got the values of how we operate as a community. So having a buy-in to a value, and to realize that when you do click a button and when you are abusive and you are humiliating and you're flaming or sexting or trolling or whatever behaviors you might choose to engage in, it does have an impact on the individuals on the receiving end. So what the research shows us is that many individuals who do engage in the bullying behaviour, and even in forums, discussion forums in classrooms and in online, it might be telling someone that what they're thinking and what they're suggesting is absolutely ridiculous and they don't know what they're talking about, etc., 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 etc. So in terms of, then it's simply for us to really pick up, for adults, it might be picking up the phone and having a conversation. So we monitor the forums. We monitor, particularly during COVID times when there was more and more opportunities for students to work in breakout rooms on Zoom, or to actually set out their own study groups. It's about monitoring how we're engaging with one another, so that the bottom line of respect, the bottom line of courtesy, the bottom line of safety is upheld. And it's having those tough decisions. And how do you know? So it's about working side by side, and it's about being in the right position. So if we choose authoritarian power over behaviour with individuals who are bullying, we are modelling for them what we are telling them is not okay. So we need to really look at our way of interacting with individuals or groups who choose the bullying behaviour. So we talk about, interestingly, there's been several research articles that have looked at family behaviour. And what we're finding is that poor family management, limited in terms of not having parameters, not having boundaries, where individuals just interpret what's expected in the family in terms of how we talk to one another, what we do with one another, what's okay, what's not okay. What the research is showing us is that for many individuals, part of their profile for those who are engaging in cyberbullying is poor family management. And so that's obvious for us then as school teachers, if you're listening tonight, to think about, well, with the parent education programs that we adopt and that we're doing across the year, have we actually targeted them in terms of supporting parents to have codes of engagement, and what's not okay is not okay? So what the research is showing us is, for some of our individuals, not all of them who engage in bullying behaviour, but often it has been that authoritarian laissez-faire approach rather than the authoritative approach. And the authoritative approach is about teaching the behaviours that are expected, and guiding and practicing, revisiting and coaching, and always being firm but respectful. So the research also shows us that empathy, parental monitoring, a strong and optimistic relationship with parents, and safety at school are acknowledged to be mitigating events for cyberbullying behaviour. So they're positive things. So it's looking in the school setting, so it's looking parents who are actually there working with their youngsters. It's a positive relationship. It's about being friendly and not friend. It's about being the adult, being the one who's been on the planet longer, and it's about guiding, being the guide on the side. And the research is showing if we've got young people who have the beauty of that experience as they go through primary school and through secondary school, when they come into higher education, they're actually going to be in a better place. Because as I said to you early tonight, those individuals who move from being bullied in secondary do sometimes take that into a higher education space as well. So think about it, how brilliant for us if we're able to do empathy training with young people, if we're able to support our parents and do a lot of parent communication about where is the computer in the family, who's monitoring what's happening on the computer. A lot of the Nintendo games, the latest release of many of the Nintendo games is that the young children are actually chatting to one another across the world. And so they're just chatting and they're imagining that these are all, I speak to a lot of them and they talk to me about this is my friend and this is my friend and this is my friend. And I talk to them about the difference between a friend in real life and someone they've never met, but it's a name in a Nintendo game. But they're actually chatting, and some of the language that they're using with one another, and no adult in the vicinity. So these are 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. So if they develop a habit of this is okay in terms of a game space, and they start to develop a little bit of aggression in terms of power in some of the games, if we don't actually temper that and guide that and balance that and really bring some reality to the conversation, some of those young people will actually start to develop a persona of this is how you operate when things work or don't work. And often that is one way that some of these young people develop these habits, and it continues with them until we have somebody such as school counsellors or teachers or unit coordinators who actually intervene for a purpose, who are a purposeful intervention and come and work and teach different habits. Because as I said earlier, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. So if you want to get something different, you've got to do something different. But the only way you can do something different is if you have an adult who can guide you if you're a young person. If, as an adolescent, you have adults who can work with you. You hear me talking about WITH. It's about doing with. Cyberbullying is about doing things to people. And so for us, we're not about power over. It's about empowerment. The empowerment, power within, is really, really important. So what's great is parental supervision, where the computer is, the fact that there's times when people are using the computer, what the games are, making sure that they're not just getting free access to every single thing, and what's happening on that computer. We know with some of the work that I've done in Singapore and in other areas of Asia, that a lot of the schools, the young people are going to bed with their phones under their pillows, and they've been using the phone because the phone is where all of the school information is coming from, or their laptop, and they're constantly, it might be 1 and 2 in the morning, they're still connected to the internet. So they're doing their learning, but they're engaging socially. And sometimes they might be, as they're engaging socially, might actually be the recipients of some inappropriate behaviour from bullies. So it's about supervision is important for us as adults teaching and learning in an adult space, a higher education space. It's about us having the courage of talking about the behaviour that's okay and influencing students if they're not feeling safe to let us know, because we can't read minds. And so I think it comes back to relationship. To me, the biggest thing that I learn throughout this whole cyber safety, prevent cyberbullying area is really about relationship. You make contact with somebody, and then maybe you contract with them. You're going to be their teacher. You're going to work with them. You're their counsellor. And so you see the difference between contact, CONTACT, contract, RACT, is the R, and R is relationship. So I think the big thing for us as teachers, as educators, it's our relationship, and we've got to have integrity in that relationship, and we've got to be trustworthy. And to be trustworthy, we actually need to create a safe space. We've got to walk our talk. We can't set students up to engage in breakout rooms or in forums or in chat rooms and just let them go and do what they want. We've really got to monitor. We've got to be a careful monitor, and we've got to be an astute manager, because we are an engaging professional. So that's really, really important. So one of the things that I've talked about here, and I mentioned it earlier, is this fact of moral disengagement. And we know that individuals who engage in bullying behaviour, the bullies themselves, believe that they can hide themselves behind the screen. And the big thing here, the big problem here, and I think this is your difference between traditional bullying and cyberbullying, and why as educators we've got to have this on our radar. We can never assume that everything's safe. We can't assume that everybody knows netiquette and they're following it. We can't assume that people are feeling safe in the teaching and learning forums that we set up. Sometimes, believe it or not, even for assessments, and we don't even monitor them. And the students get distressed, and they're concerned about airing their own view because of the way people just get cut down. So it's a matter of what's the protocol that we are actually guiding students with. But this is an interesting one. We say for the moral disengagement is the fact that often you think you're hidden behind the screen. So you've got a different code of ethics, a different code of behaving. And the other thing I find with adults, and those of you who are part of the conversation, well, it's not really a conversation, I'm talking more than us having a conversation, but who are part of the session tonight, is that often the adults, when I talk with them, and they've been part of our Prevent Cyberbullying website that we've developed across Australasia for the last 10 plus years, is that many of the adults in higher ed will say to me, but Dr. Marg, I was just being funny. It's just funny. It's just funny. It's just funny. And the difficulty is for them to see choice and consequence. So the choice is they're choosing to engage in the power over behaviour. The consequence is they're not actually seeing the consequence of their actions. And so one of the areas that many of the students in higher education have worked on with me, and if you do have a look at our website, we've got lots of videos, but one of the videos and the students themselves develop the videos. And one of the videos that they always have done is having this screen down between two people. And, would you actually say that to me in person? Would you actually say what you've just said to me in person? And they're reading out what was said on a social media site about the other person. And so it is this belief that I'm untouchable. I'm safe. And so for us, it really is about taking a stand and teaching consequences. Choices plus action equal consequences, and there are consequences for behaviour. So there is opportunities in this space that the individuals who choose the bullying behaviour to remain blameless, because they don't know in some instances who's on the receiving end, other instances they know terribly well who's on the receiving end. And so their intention often is to embarrass, to hurt, to humiliate, to offend, to get revenge, to have fun, and to deliberately exert power over others. And so for those of you who are listening tonight in schools or as counsellors or psychologists, social workers within our own ACAP graduates, you'll be familiar probably with the work of William Glasser. And Dr. Glasser, pioneer of choice theory, and he talks about fun, freedom, belonging, survival and safety as our generic needs, power as one of the generic needs as well. So he says that in the, in the area of bullying, it's about power over. And for us, it's about, he says that to meet the need for power, he's not talking about power over, he talks about empowerment, and knowledge is power. So from a counselling perspective, if you come from a choice theory perspective, working in schools, working in higher education, in your own families, it's about what's the knowledge that we communicate with others so that they are empowered to be able to disconnect when this bullying behaviour is happening, to switch it off, not to buy in, not to believe what's being said, and that their own identity isn't dictated to by these bullies. And so for us as grown-ups, for us in the role of being a teacher, as a parent, as a friend, family member, how do we best support? It's about helping them realize that they are a person in their own right, a gifted person with so much to give, and their identity is not dictated to by somebody who chooses to hide behind the screen and humiliate and embarrass. So a lot of the work we've been doing in the cyberbullying area is also looking very much at identity. And I know for those of us who are in the counselling courses, the biggest thing that you learn is you're developing your own professional identity. So for us, it's helping our young people, helping our adults, helping our adolescents, helping children in terms of developing their own identity. And it's not connected to what the bully is saying in terms of the humiliation, the hurt, the embarrassment. Now, just changing tune a little bit, or just to share with you some information that we've picked up that looks at gender. And we say that females named gender compared with ethnicity by males as the primary motivation of them being bullied online as adolescents and as adults. Being upset by or being bullied by the victim were also motivating factors for cyberbullying behaviour. So this is something that's very important, and that's where the person behind the screen does actually know who they're setting up to fail. So it's the fact that often the different genders will have different motivations, and they also seek help in different ways, and who their own way of coping and their own way of dealing. Females have flagged disliking the person as the reason for cyberbullying, compared with males stating bullying is fun, it's pleasurable. So we know that the big challenge for us is that females, more than males, actually reach out and they'll tell their friends, their partners, or their family. We find that in higher education institutions, a small number of our students actually reach out to the academics, to the administration staff, or to the support personnel. And we know in schools that that's starting to change because it's not the elephant in the room anymore, cyberbullying. We're actually out there and we're talking about it. And I think in many ways, COVID that influenced or pushed us to go into online teaching and learning has made us be comfortable and confident to talk about this elephant in the room, that cyberbullying is not okay. This is what it is, etc., 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 etc. So I'll just read this out to you in terms of, for females, cyber victimization is associated with depression because the self-focus on the imaginary audience being aware of their humiliation. So that's not the same for males, but it's the same for females. So in terms of minority populations, what we're finding is that there is a big lack of research in the area of LGBTIQ youth being included in cyberbullying research, because cyberbullying for this population of individuals is very, very high. And we know that it seems to correlate with the events of coming out and forming of romantic relationships. So for a researcher's perspective and for family members and for educators, it's really important for us to start to burrow a lot deeper below the surface and see, let's get some research happening here. Let's get some practices. Let's be proactive in this area. So we have got, 4 or 5 articles in terms of adolescents in schools that we're working with, but it's an area that we know it's a vulnerable group, but we need to really look carefully in terms of our interventions and our strategies. So have a bit of a think now and jot down, let's say 5 possible outcomes of cyberbullying on an individual's life experience. So I've just shared one in terms of talking about females, in terms of it really affected their own image of themselves, and they were actually imagining the humiliation. They imagined that everybody in the audience could sense their humiliation. So that impacting them actually resulted in them engaging in depressing behaviour. So that's an obvious one. But I'm asking you to have a bit of a think about what might be some of the other outcomes for individuals who are on the receiving end. So not the ones I've got up there, think about a couple of others. And I've deliberately put that slide up there just to reiterate for you that cyberbullying is something that just hasn't happened recently. I've deliberately chosen an article that was written close to 10 years ago for you to see that this has been an issue for a long time, but beautifully, we're talking about it a lot more. So I've got some of we know with cyberbullying behavior, this is what we're finding with individuals. They're anxious, often they'll have trouble in terms of many of them, it may even be drugs and alcohol misuse. We know for some of them, it actually is the lower self-esteem, high risk of anxiety, and for some even it will be the difficulties engaging in school, and it might even be social behaviour challenges. I know in school, I worked as a guidance officer for many years, and I worked as a consultant to schools for many years. And a lot of the children that I worked with who were bullied used to spend most of their time in the last class before recess, before morning tea and lunch, planning in their own mind how they were going to go and get their lunch bag, eat their lunch, get to a safe space before the bully would attack them. And so they would have they used to draw these incredible maps of how they would actually get around unnoticed. And for many of the young people I've worked with, there was a crew of them who actually, they had their own sense of a group and an identity. They were surviving. And the sad thing for me as an educator is we go to school to thrive. You go to higher education to thrive. And if you're just surviving because you're worried what's actually going to happen here, and this is traditional bullying. So for our young people, in terms of even if they look at the phones, lots of schools now are actually, when schools are back and you're physically on the campus like we are here in Brisbane, a lot of the schools, we've got the policies where they don't have their phone. So they'll hand their phone in at the beginning of the day and they get their phone back at the end of the day. But for many of the young people I've worked with is that fear of turning that phone on at the end of the day and seeing the humiliating messages that have come through. So for me, I think, we've got to get this right, because for young people, their life and their belief about themselves can be determined by an individual hiding behind the screen, getting a sense of power and empowerment themselves to be able to crucify somebody else. So the reason you're on tonight and the reason I'm talking about this and the reason Will has actually said, let's do something to really confirm how important it is to create safe spaces in teaching and learning and become aware of cyberbullying is because there's the potential for this type of behaviour for an individual. Some of you who are counsellors listening tonight or psychologists, you'll be working with clients who present to you either as the bully, as the witness, or as the victim. And so it's, how do we bring them back to give them that sense of joy, to give them a sense of purpose, and to give them a sense of meaning so that they matter, because they do matter and they're on everybody's radar for the right reason. And so one of the things we know with cyberbullying, victims are on their radar because they can persecute them, they can humiliate them, they're targets. But for us, we live in a society where we want people to be on our radar for the right reasons. And so it's really about bringing back into our sense of relationship, our sense of interaction with others, that feeling of compassion, that feeling of courtesy, which is very, very important. Now, right at the beginning tonight, I put up some slides and I said, wow, look at that large number, 27 or 28, Will, I think, 29 million we had in Oceania who are actually engaging in the internet. And so the reason I did that at the very beginning is just to get us the landscape of how many people are actually playing here in this backyard. Now, then I deliberately interrogated with you a definition of cyberbullying. Then we've actually had a little bit of a look and we've gone a little bit deeper in terms of elements. We've looked at a number of different things. So I want you to keep that in your mind as I'm going to share with you a little bit about the prevalence. Now, I said earlier on that the Safety Commissioner has identified, and this was 2017, and I'd be surprised if this actually was lower, but in 2017 it was 1 in 5 Australian young people reported cyberbullying behaviour. 1 in 5. You've got 25 people in your classroom. You've got a fair number of students who are coping with that as well as the academic curriculum. So it's a real concern. Now, once again, I'm going to go through some of the prevalence rates with you, because in the universities as well, higher education, where we are here at ACAP, it'll be interesting to share with you. But keep in mind, the prevalence rates across the world are not necessarily accurate, because, well, they are accurate, but they may be a different definition. So when you are reading a paper, you're reading a journal article, you're reading something, or you're communicating with family, and you're communicating with your school community, what's really important is that you're very clear about our definition of cyberbullying is this, and this is what our stats are showing us. But the prevalence rates also depend on the time parameter used to measure cyberbullying, the age of participants, the country in which the data is collected. And some of you might be interested here. We're doing research across all of the secondary schools in Singapore, looking the secondary schools to look at, with the ministry, to look at cyberbullying behaviour, prevalence and responses. So it's a project obviously halted with COVID happening and a number of things. But if any of you are interested in learning a little bit more as the findings come out, as we actually collect the data, just let us know. Let Will know via email, and we can send you some information. But it might not be for about a year, but we're heavily involved looking at that space. But let me just share with you, most studies report in the higher education space 10 to 40% of our students who have experienced cyberbullying behaviour as an adult. Now, that is irrespective of those 3 schools of thought I talked about earlier in terms of the definition. Now, sometimes it will be that the belief is that 10 to 40%, that's a pretty large range, but all of the researchers working in this space are very certain that the rate is a lot higher than that, because it does depend. Is it a questionnaire? Are we asking people to self-identify? Have we given them a definition of what cyberbullying is? Are we saying, have you experienced it in the last 5 minutes, or have you experienced it in the last 5 months, or in the last 5 years? And I know myself, when we were getting together all of the questionnaires for our research over in Singapore, we've actually had to bring together a number of different questionnaires, etc., to be able to capture the essence and truly to give us an authentic picture of what's happening here. So when you think about it, the statistics, that statistic is very high. So you might have a student, and the big word on everybody's lips at the moment is we look after our own mental health, our own well-being, take care of yourself, self-care. So part of that, we focus on ourselves, but we've also got to make sure that the balance for individuals in our family or in our classroom, if they are really connected and so engaged in the internet, are they actually getting a space? And is it safe engagement? So even pondering some questions and putting some questions out there and having a conversation in a classroom, in the family, in the student lounge is a positive investment in understanding the lived experience of others. And if we find we've got a couple of alarm bells going, that's great, because it's showing us we can't be relaxed and thinking everything's okay. We actually have to up the ante. So there's been studies in Canada that actually are showing that individuals, so this is adolescents, who are both victims and bullies, they experience the impact of cyberbullying the most. So it's the greatest intensity. So in some circles, they're a victim. In other circles, they're actually a bully. And this is for adolescents. So this is really important to think about as well. So these adolescents present often with suicidal thoughts, very low self-esteem. And they feel, which is really concerning, uncared for and not on the radar of their teachers. And they don't feel safe at school. So this is there's a lot of research that's happened through Canada over the years. So that's really interesting for those of you listening tonight, working with adolescents, just to think about, have you got somebody who actually marries victim, bully, really big impact for them, but then what's happening for them. We also look at the UK. There's a lot of research that's come through the UK that talks about self-harm for young people, adolescents and primary school people who have identified being a victim of cyberbullying. And so they are greater risk than individuals who are blissfully ignorant of cyberbullying behaviour. Now, there's two researchers, if you are interested in reading a little bit more, Hinder and Patchen, Hinduja and Patchen. Now, they've been around researching in this area, a bit like Ken Rigby, for a very long time, and they're really, really prominent and very important researchers, and they're practitioners. You'll love them because it's just so practical, and they also have the generosity of spirit that they've developed magnificent resources, and it's there for everybody. And their resources are based on evidence. Because if you click on the internet and you're looking for something, there's a lot out there in terms of questionnaires you can use in schools or higher education, or you can use as a counsellor with a client, but it hasn't actually been researched. So it's not evidence-based. So it's probably not a safe tool to use. But these two, they're gifts. They give us a lot of information. And what's interesting is they've changed their position since I started working in this space many, many years ago. And they're actually saying, initially they were saying that, you know, it's not, cyberbullying does not lead and, you know, to someone in terms of the suicidal thinking. But what they found over the time is, and they're now saying that all forms of peer aggression, we have to take it seriously. So they are saying that there's a potential that people can get negative thinking a lot more than they thought originally. And they probably are one of our most active researchers worldwide. So that will be really useful for you to have a look at. So what I'm saying is that there are serious impacts for us to be conscious of. You've identified some yourself. Perhaps I've identified a couple more for you to be conscious of. The more you look, the more the alarm bells go off and you think, wow, we can't be complacent in this space. We've actually got to make sure that we continue being a champion. We're a champion of cyber safety. So making sure that when we do things, we've got this in mind as well. So, oops. In terms of, this is from the E-Safety Commissioner, where they're saying in Australia, and this is 2017, but this is the latest results that they've got. 1 in 5 Australian young people, now that's 15% of primary school students and 24% of teenagers, adolescents, admitted behaving in a negative way and being a bully to others online. They called them names, they deliberately excluded them, and they spread lies and rumours. Of this number, more than 90% had a negative experience themselves. So that's really very interesting. So, you know, is it the chicken and the egg? So they've had a negative experience, so they've upped the ante and they've chosen, this is my vehicle to survive and to get my power back by engaging in power over bullying behaviour with others. And, you know, we're saying 15%, 1 in 5, 15% of young people, youngsters in primary, 24% of teenagers. So it really is quite interesting in terms of the way people think. And I think, you know, you hear the phrase in counselling a lot. We talk about you just don't want to survive, you want to thrive. And so you don't want to be put down, being put down and put down. And for some of these youngsters, their way of fighting back and gaining power, which William Glasser says is a generic need for all of us, is actually about then retaliating yourself. So that's part of the conversations that we need to have. And they're tough conversations, but we need to have them. And we just don't have them once. We've got to revisit and we've got to have them at all different stages, life stages for young people. Because we know teenagers, for example, it's a natural life stage of taking risks, doing a number of different things. So it's us being relevant in the young person's life so that we can be influential when we have the conversation. You'll never be relevant, you'll never be influential unless you have a relationship. And you'll never have a relationship with someone unless you're a trustworthy person. And trust is based on character and competence. And so it's all part of the quagmire. But just give you a little bit of information before we look at the practicalities of what we'll keep doing is that, and giving you some practical examples, is that what we've found in the research that students who've been bullied in higher education, in cyber bullying and traditional bullying, have a history of victimisation in primary and secondary schooling. And that's really very concerning for us. And I think that's one of the biggest motivating factors for the Prevent Cyberbullying website that I've been leading for close to a decade now, is because I worked off the premise if the strategies weren't working in primary and secondary, we've actually got to look at a different way of connecting in the adult world. So students are advocating, whether they're primary students, secondary students, or higher education students, they're advocating for more education in fostering safer online social teaching and learning environments. And and this just a second, I'm just going to see if we've got any water. No, that's all right. So excuse me. So in terms of, this is really important because the individuals, the students themselves are saying, we actually need more education. When someone is involved, there needs to be a clear path of where and who they go to for support or report, what evidence is needed and what the supports are. And I'm sure those of you who are working in counselling, schools and higher education, you're familiar with this. And as I said earlier tonight, we're finding schools, the young people in schools are more comfortable reaching out and they know that there are processes. But in higher education, there's a quagmire where students are fearful if they actually reach out and say that there's bullying happening, that it might come back to haunt them. If they feel that there's bullying happening with their educator towards them rather than their peers with one another. So it's a matter of what's the processes, what's the protocols, so that people can report what's happening and we can investigate and do the right thing by everybody. So it really is about every voice counts and every situation is important. The big thing we're finding is that when students are saying, help us, give us more education, we want a safe learning environment, and educators, you have to take the lead here in terms of really helping direct us so it can become a community of learners. You can't just expect us to know this by osmosis. So one of the big areas that's come through is many of our adolescents and our adult students are actually saying, we want to burrow deep below the surface and have an understanding of codes of engagement, and we want to know what's right and what's not right in challenging behaviours. And we want to know how far we can go in our own right, and then when do we reach out? And the fact that we're listened to and we're heard. Now, a big challenge we have as counsellors and as parents, as grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc., sometimes is that sometimes when people say, I've given you my opinion, but you didn't go with it, so you didn't listen to me. So it's a matter of us having the conversations about being genuinely present in the moment, listening with the intent to understand, and it is really trying to get to the heart of the matter. But it may be that that individual wants us to use bullying tactics over the person who was the bully. So we've actually got to look at, we're not into crucifix land. We're not going to crucify people. How can we be fair and reasonable, ethical and transparent? And so what's coming through, and once again, if you are interested, I'm happy to share with you, we've got codes of engagement that we've developed for schools and for higher education institutions. In fact, I know last year ACAP had all of our codes of engagement in the counselling Moodle space, so that the students would look at those codes of engagement and they'd be interrogated with the students as well. So it wasn't read my mind and think this is what it is. We were actually very explicit. So when we talk about, well, what's the way forward? Our way forward is probably what you're currently doing. But hopefully tonight I've put an injection of energy for you to spend a little bit of time and think about, am I doing it consistently enough, or am I doing it occasionally? And perhaps the consistency needs to be one step better. So we talk about engage positively, know your online world, and choose consciously what you're actually going to engage in. So the digital footprint is really important for students to understand. So when we say know your online world, it's about students understanding that when they have photos, when they actually say things, when they're boasting or they're trash talking online, that there's a record of that. And on our website, we have Hayes Recruiting actually doing a 1 or 2 minute video, and they talk about one of the things that they do when they vet candidates for positions is they actually go and do a sweep of social media. And if there's anything which is negative, trash talking, flaming, any of those types of behaviours, the person doesn't even get to the shortlist. And so for adolescents and for adults, that's very important to understand. Behaviour choices have consequences. And consequences, some you can control in terms of what you actually upload and how you engage, and others it might be out of your jurisdiction. So it's thinking about what we actually need to do. Oops, and I've turned that off, which is not what I meant. So the big thing I suggest for you to think about is if, this is for us as adults, if you've never searched yourself online, tonight treat yourself. Get yourself a nice cup of water or tea or coffee or something that might be a little bit stronger, and actually look at your own digital footprint. Type your name in and see what actually comes up. So the big thing to think about, digital conduct can be easily accessed. So what you do does matter. And this is not just about being behind the screen and doing something. This is about yourself also portraying how you want others to see you. Now, what's important, and I said this really early on tonight, is there is so much that the internet offers. So much. Look at what we're doing tonight. Absolutely brilliant. Here, Will and I are on the campus here in Brisbane, and we've got people from all around the country listening in terms of Zoom. You're coming in real time. Some of you might be listening at your own time. Now, that would never have been possible. So wonderful things are happening. So tonight, whilst we're looking at the downside of what can happen in online spaces, there's also an enormous upside. So I'm just going to put up here the digital conduct. We talk about rights and responsibilities. Now, if you are interested in the code of conduct that I talked about, Will and I can send it to you, or the team can send it to you, no problem at all. But what we've done in a lot of the research is we actually, and this is interesting up here, this will be interesting for those of you from schools, when you know you're developing your code of conduct, you base it on rights and responsibilities, and then that will go to codes of engagement, and then that will go to what am I doing, what am I not doing, and you're unpacking it, you demystify it. It's not read my mind, this is what it is. So what we've got here is when we're working in this space, and this is the code of conduct that we'll send out to you for anyone interested. It was based on rights and responsibilities. We started with that really very much at the beginning. So if you're thinking about what's something I can take away from Marg's talk tonight, lots of things she's talked about has affirmed what I'm doing. Perhaps the Rights and Responsibilities Charter is something that you have developed, but maybe it's time to go back and revisit it. Maybe it's time just to see, and what might you do differently, what might you add to it. So it's just helpful. So you might be thinking, well, I have the right to protect my digital reputation. I have the right to have my own viewpoint. And even if others don't, I have a right to live a balanced life, online, offline. I have a right to be free from humiliation online. So a lot of this, as we're looking at it, this is for families. When I work with families and we develop a family code of how we're going to work together, I might have family meetings, and it's based on this. But this is lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of writing. So we break it down, and we might just have a picture and a word, but this is the backstory. So when we're talking about our learning spaces, our teaching spaces being safe in COVID times and beyond, because we're so much engaged in the online world, think about what are the rights and responsibilities. And if I went into your Zoom classroom tomorrow and had a conversation with your students, whether they're 95 or whether they're 5 years of age, would they be able to talk with me about how you've established and set up your rights and responsibilities charter of how we engage so it's a safe space online? So think about what you're doing, celebrate if you're on track. If you're on your way there, just keep moving. And if this is a new concept, have a bit of a think about, How might I apply that? For those of us who are counsellors in the room, there's a lot here that you can work with in terms of when your client brings their story to you, you're working with them in their world to their satisfaction. And so for you to help them build and restore their identity, perhaps the rights and responsibilities, values might be a really lovely way to begin. And so that empathetic confrontation might be an interesting one to engage in terms of a micro skill with them. So what I've got up here is some ways for us. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is just to think a little bit of the strategies you're currently doing. So can I ask you, stay with me a little bit longer. Some of the strategies that you use in your classrooms that are really about preventing negative, demeaning online engagement. So I've got some up there. You can actually have a little bit of a look at that. And that's probably a no-brainer. A lot of you might think, yep, yep, yep. Or you might think, oh, I know that stuff, but I've actually never given it any air. I haven't revisited it with the students. I haven't revisited it with my staff. I haven't revisited it with the group of teachers who really are struggling in terms of working with students rather than reacting to students. So perhaps some of these things might be an interesting revisit. So think about what you're doing at this point in time. And some of those, you know, I've said down there, we've got ignore and resist the temptation to retaliate. So a lot of those things are easy to write. They're hard to do. Teachers and counsellors, psychologists, you know, one of the big challenges here that hinders our young people and our adults and our adolescents is emotion regulation. Being able to put the brakes on, be able to be calm in the moment, to think about an alternative of what to do if, what to do when. So it's about really helping flexible problem solving and thinking about in the moment, in the moment. So we talk about first impulse, the fallacy of the first impulse. So you've got an incident that happens that somebody might actually put something derogatory on Facebook, and the pattern is person on the receiving end, it might be me, I might retaliate, or I might retaliate, or I might just be very quiet. The cyberbully continues. I might then decide to react, or I might decide to disengage. So I've got a habit. So if my habit isn't helpful, then I've got to start to develop a new habit. But it's no use me trying to develop that new habit in the moment. So as counsellors, we know we practice with our clients when they're working with us. So when they leave our session, they then practice out in their lived world. Teachers, you know, you can do brilliant work in the classroom. Student goes out into the playground as if you never had a conversation, or they go home that night. So it's a matter of how do we get their buy-in so that they're actually realizing this is all very important. And it's easy. It's simply a matter of us helping them develop problem-solving skills, helping them to build their empathy, helping students develop flexible thinking, and really understanding the choice and the consequence. What if then? So there's some of the things that we engage with. So these would be some of the different things. It's interesting how many of you have changed your password online in the last month. When I lived in Singapore, the conversation used to be, you change your password as often as you change your toothbrush, and you change your toothbrush every month. And where I worked, we would have a new password every month. And so it's a matter of, for myself, sometimes I get very complacent and I use the same password for many, many, many things because I sometimes think, oh, it's easier. And then I have my other thought thinking, well, that's probably not very smart because if I use the same one all the time and everybody knows it, I'm actually setting myself up here. So it's a matter of making sure that some of these things that we talk about, and do we actually do it? Do we walk our talk? So that's the big challenge. We know parents of young children, you have the option to install a bullying app on your smartphone, and that can be altered and you can be alerted when there is suspicious online behaviour. The challenge, of course, for parents is striking the balance between getting involved in children's lives and their online lives, setting limits regarding cyber safety, and keeping an open line of communication about being cyber smart with your children. So there are apps there, but we've also got to work, what's the balance? How do we engage wearing the parent hat while we're doing that as well? So psychoeducation is a big area that we look at in this whole space of what do we do. And I've referred to psychoeducation as we've gone along this evening. And some of those I talked about were choice consequence exercises, sometimes a behaviour contract in terms of how often you're going to be online and then when you're going to actually do some offline activities. Quite novel idea, but a good thing to do. Cognitive emotion decision balance sheets, having things such as a change worksheet. So deciding what you want to change, what's your plan, what's your goal, who would be around you if you relapsed, what might you do then. So these are a lot of strategies that we engage in psychoeducation. But also we know that and I've got up there, I've got the Centre for Contemplative Practice up there, and there's some beautiful, if you do go online, I encourage you to go online for this, the Tree of Contemplative Practice, you can actually click on the different sections on the tree and it takes you into a different ways of meditating, being peaceful in the moment. So part of psychoeducation might also be relaxation, but it might be some of our students might prefer to learn some of the relaxation from the East rather than purely from us as Westerners. So the Tree of Contemplative Practice is a beautiful gift that we have that we can use with youngsters and we can use all the way through to, I know I've used it with my grandmother who died after the age of 100. So some of these strategies that we use on a regular basis, not because she engaged in cyberbullying, but just to help her feel peaceful and content in the moment, which was really important. But what I'm suggesting is that do look at what are your strategies for psychoeducation. Obviously, having class meetings, having circle meetings, having yarning circles, they're very, very valuable. I never cease to be amazed when I'm invited to a yarning circle and I sit and listen to adults in workplaces, to young children in early childhood, and they talk when I'm talking to them about cyber safety, etc., and what they share about their experiences absolutely amazes me. And what they're sharing is most of them have had an experience of cyberbullying as a bully or as a victim. So it's really quite an eye-opener for myself and for the education teams. And it's saying to us, okay, how will we work here so we can create a safer space? And it's only when we create that safe space so people can talk without us judging them that we've probably got a chance to start to make a bit of a difference. We know that monitoring children's access to the internet and effectively talking with them about cyber safety is effective in starting to create positive habits of engaging online. And that's a tough gig. I know I've been talking with my family. Some of them have got 5 and 6 and 7-year-old children, and they've all gone through COVID, so that the children have been exposed a lot more to online learning and to apps and all sorts of things. And I know my family are sitting and struggling with, you know, how do we talk to the children about cyber safety? How do we do this? How do we do this? How do we do this? And I know for grown-ups that the internet has been a lifesaver. It's been a lifeline for many people last year, really getting that sense of connectedness. So it's how do we bring people and have the tough conversations and the important conversations. For those of you listening tonight who work with adolescents, what I want to share with you is that the research is showing us, and I've been involved in it as well, is that adolescents who participate in peer-led interventions have fewer instances of cyberbullying behaviour and victimisation. But we know that in terms of with bystander and upstander research, we talk a lot about be an upstander or be a bystander. But interestingly, as I said very early on today, there's not a lot of research that's showing us that that is actually a very strong way to go. What's the best bystander programs? What's the best upstander? I know New Zealand has done some beautiful work in this space of upstanders. So, and I've looked at some of their reports. They're leading the world, I think. And some of you on the platform tonight might also be leading the world in what you're doing in your own backyard. But we know that here's some more self-help tips for you here that you might already be doing, or they might be ones for you to consider. But we know that the bystanders are in a privileged position, and many of the bystanders I talk with will say to me, I'm reluctant to become an upstander because I might be the next person who's bullied in the online platform. So it's better for me to sit by and be passive. But what I do often is I'll reach out to that person if I know them, and I'll deliberately inject time in that relationship with that individual and talk with them in terms of knowing that there is support mechanisms in place, and that maybe helpline might be a way to go, or counselling, or seeking support from friends or family, which is really important. So once again, in terms of, we talk about, this is familiar information that I've got up here. It won't be a surprise to you in terms of some of the practical strategies that we suggest if you are on the receiving end of being bullied. And I listen to myself as I say that, and I think, you sound a little bit complacent there. So what's important is, I know this stuff because I live and breathe it, but everybody else mightn't live and breathe it as much. So it is important, check in. I check in all the time with my family and extended family about cyber safety, and it's comfortable. It's not, oh my God, here she goes again, she's interrogating us. I sit and I talk, I'm interested and I learn. I talk to their parents. They probably think I might be nagging them, but it is about bringing it back, that we actually do need to be guides on the side as adults. We've lived on this world a lot more than the students in our classrooms and the children in our family. So it is important that we don't just assume everybody knows. So this is here, how to report. I would think that that's something familiar for most of you who have engaged in having to report. And I certainly have had to do this a number of times to report comments, and that it's cyberbullying, and that it's taken down immediately. Understand the other person's thinking, and that's for all of us in terms of as counsellors, as teachers, as principals, as leaders. We need to understand, but as you've heard me say several times tonight, we have to be trustworthy. We've got to have character, so we've got to have integrity, and everybody, it's about relationship. So you're never going to get a window or a glimpse into someone's world unless you have a respectful mutual relationship. And only once you've got that have you got the privilege of understanding where they're coming from. Of course, those of you listening tonight who do have the counselling expertise, you've got the skill set to be able to understand another person in their world to their satisfaction. So for you, it's probably something that is not a difficult thing to do, because you do that every single day. But just to finish off, and I'm just looking here, I wanted to share for those counsellors, psychologists and school counsellors that might be on the line tonight, some of the counselling approaches that we use. We know narrative therapy is a really good approach. We know motivational interviewing is a very good approach to use with young people to get to the heart of the matter. We also know choice theory and cognitive behaviour therapy are also effective approaches when we're working with individuals in a counselling space. So think about it when you think about narrative, for example, and open dialogue is another approach, which is a build on from family therapy. So there is different approaches that you as school counsellors or counsellors in higher education or counsellors out in private practice, you probably could add and do a whole session. And I'd love to talk with you a whole session on the different therapeutic approaches, because there's some great work that's happening out there. Marry that with psychoeducation, marry that with self-tips, marry that with being a guide on the side, marry that with having a clear understanding and a commitment to creating safe spaces. We're probably getting in the right territory to create a safe learning environment for our students and for ourselves. So folks, I've looked at the clock here, and I don't think I'm hoping our clock's not actually correct that I'm looking, because it's telling me I've gone nearly 2 hours over. So, but I'm going to finish now and do a question and answer. Will's just given me a reminder. We have a couple of programs that we have here in ACAP, and we have, obviously, we've got the Masters, the Graduate Diploma, and the Bachelor's, but we've also got some really beautiful, innovative courses. And one, for those of you working in schools, I'd encourage you to seriously consider. We have a graduate certificate of wellbeing in schools. We started it last year. This will be our third trimester, and we're really heartened. We started with a small group of students, and we're heartened we've quadrupled that small number. And it is only 4 units. And it's been written, there's a number of us who've written the program. My background is as a school counsellor. I've worked as a school counsellor for a long time. I've taught the school counselling program at a previous university. And everybody who's developed the program, we're actually practitioners in the field. So it's 4 units. It really is about building and enhancing your knowledge to support your teachers, your families, your students in terms of well-being, mental well-being. So obviously, and Will just reminding me, obviously, one of the pillars that we look at is creating the safe space, and creating the safe space is making sure that online is safe, just as in the classroom. But we started on the 8th of February, which was Monday. And if you are interested, though, do let our team know. And this is just our first week. So you would be able to join us if you wanted to join us for next week. We have the whole development of the site has been quite innovative, and it's a very different way of how we've developed the site. We did it with Navitas, their IT department. And so all of the material is actually online. Believe it or not, you don't need to come to a campus. And your commitment is 2 hours, 5 times over the trimester for the classes. So there's 5 2-hour interactive tutorials. And the alternative weeks is we have consultation drop-in sessions where you can come and work with the students, you work with the teacher. It's an invitation, it's not an obligation. One of the reasons we have the consultation drop-ins is that students said they wanted to be more visible on the radar of their peers and of their educators. And so the drop-in sessions enable us to do that. So do have a think about it. It's a great program. I'm really proud that it's happened on my watch with the team. We also have a couple of other programs, but I'm not going to talk about those programs tonight, but we do have a couple of other grad certs which are very exciting, and they're cutting edge for us. I think we lead the field in a couple of those programs. But that's it about programs. I'm just looking at Will. He's guiding me in terms of what my next step is.
All right, so we'll get into the Q&A. I've just turned my microphone on so everyone can hear the questions that I'm asking. I think you mentioned a website. Was that the Prevent Cyberbullying?
HE website, yep.
So that's preventcyberbullying.com. I think it might be down.
Today it's down. We've been, it is, and we've been trying to get through to the domain. So it is actually active, but it's down for some reason.
So
wait till the end of the week.
And it should be back up, and there's a lot of good resources on there. So that was preventcyberbullyinghe.com. Linda's also put a couple of comments here. Was a really good way to encourage communication and involving them in the process to help to determine what is appropriate class behaviours.
I love that. I think Linda, you're right in terms of we have a baseline of what we expect, and then it's the negotiation, so they buy in, and it's a community. It's not our community, us as educators. It's our community with the students, and I think you are. Our big challenge was in terms of the camera on, and it's really wanting the meaningful engagement. A lot of our students were saying they wanted to see others. And the reason we've moved here at ACAP away from having the lecture where we might have 200 students to having that set as mandated attendance, we've got that as a live stream and recorded, so students can listen, or they can listen at a later date, but it's the interactive tute that's important. And I know when the workshops are 2 days, it's a long time on camera. So it's just a matter of how do you get the balance. But I appreciate what you're saying.
How has for in power over? I guess the Snapchat play in cyberbullying.
I think it has. I think it certainly has emerged. And I think one of the big challenges is it's there for a very short time. There isn't as, there was a huge following initially in that space. And the difficulty there is it's there 1 minute and it's not there the next. And in terms of trying to get the evidence. And so one of the big areas that we find is it's not as prominent as Facebook is for the cyberbullying behaviour.
Philip has asked, I think it's quite a complex question, I guess. Is it not possible to block cyberbullies?
No, it's a great question. It's a brilliant question, and 99% of us, as we listen to this, would say that. The research is showing us that adolescents will agree with us, but they won't do it. Young people, whilst they're developing their understanding of morality and all sorts of things, are more reliant on the adult, taking the adult role and actually putting the settings in adults. For many times when I know cyberbullying is happening, and it might be happening because there's a divorce, there's a breakup in a relationship, and it might be the first year or 2 years or even 3 years where one partner is continually bullying the other. And the obvious thing is just click off, get yourself a different phone, get yourself a number. But being able to disengage is a real challenge. So I see where you're coming from. I know exactly what you're saying, but the research is showing us that it's far harder than that.
Yeah. So a sort of related question here from another attendee is, victims for block, delete, or the bullying, report bullying to except for the teachers, principals, and counsellors?
Often we find friends are very important. In fact, in the adolescent years, it's often the friends that then tell their own parents, or they might tell, it mightn't be a teacher that they've got this year, but it might be a teacher that's they've had a connection with in the past, or it might be an after-hours school care coordinator. So one of the things I always did was, in my classrooms, I've always, and in my practice, always had helpline numbers for children and for adolescents so that they could actually ring. So it might not be in their immediate, but it might be a helpline. And many times a friend that they've shared with will ring the helpline. So friends are very, very important. But friends often will talk to their own parents, and then that's a cycle.
Yeah.
In some, I was looking at that. I know in terms of we've looked at that, just working on a paper recently, and we've got different states who actually have different legislation in terms of what will actually happen when people engage. And the biggest thing is it's looking more at the stalking behaviour, and it might be stalking online, and it might be physically stalking. And so that's why the e-commissioner site is an interesting site in terms of their own definitions. But there's a lot of work coming out through, and we've got the legal team at one of the universities who's written a lot about the legalities of cyberbullying on our Prevent Cyberbullying HE website. So how we've got this site going is we get anybody who's interested, and everybody contributes. We have it's led by students. And 2 years ago, we had, with all of the different things happening in Queensland with cyberbullying and the very sad outcomes, we had a whole discipline, a legal discipline approach us, and they wanted to do some fact sheets, etc., so that they could make it really clear.
So we've got a couple of pretty long ones here, so I'll just kind of read them through because I think there's a sort of couple of comments and questions mixed in. So we've had someone ask, a well-adjusted child may be unlikely to engage in bullying and or may possess the resilience to withstand the bullying. How do we address a child from a neglected family or who may suffer from a lack of confidence and low academic skills to work with them to provide the support they need against the forces of bullying? Unfortunately, bullying in every form has many confounding variables that can influence the ultimate success of the bully.
Look, I think that's a great question. In 10 years of my life, I worked with those ones who were on nobody's radar. They were young people who you wouldn't even know if they didn't attend, and most schools weren't interested on whether they attended or not, because sometimes they were really challenging because of their lived experience, which was out of their control. So for me, working in the field now for over 30 years, for me, the biggest thing is relationship. For that individual to know that they matter on someone's life, they're on somebody's radar, is absolutely critical. And then starting to work, because it is about building resilience. And we have the power to influence working with young people. Their life might be incredibly tough, but so many of these young people, their story is against the odds. I am every day just so impressed with people I've worked with that are against the odds, similar tough times, neglected, people weren't interested, all sorts of things. But they had a connection. But also I find, if it's possible, if you've got school counsellors, linking in with the counsellor, being involved in group programs, being involved with, we used to do a lot of things with the paraprofessionals in the school. So it may be, yep, the academic wasn't their strength, but they had strengths in so many other areas. So looking at different ways for them to meet their curriculum needs and giving them leadership potential and possibilities, perhaps being a mentor for youngsters in the primary. If their gift is music, if their gift is drawing, what's their gift, and use that gift as a way to teach about how do we communicate that sense of identity and purpose, but also for them to take leadership roles. So it's just a matter of us trying to, and a lot of these young people do everything they can to barricade us trying to be part of their world, because for so many years, a lot of people that they've allowed in have let them down. So it is about, I do believe we can make a huge difference, a positive difference in the life of another person.
Good. Tess has said, wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. I keep stumbling on the intention ingredient of cyberbullying. When I counsel, I observe so much bullying within relationships. However, it is often not intentional, but rather from a position of ignorance or lack of awareness of the purpose it serves to protect or enhance the bully in some way. I similarly see bullying behaviour and power over format, even between counsellors and online platforms. It appears even these counsellors are not aware of intent. So the intent seems to differentiate between the loss of social norms online, which allow meanness, and the absolute persecution of another. But I would say both situations are bullying.
Yeah, I think Trish, you've summed it up beautifully. And I think you don't know what you don't know. I think you're exactly correct. We don't put the magnifying glass up to ourselves. We put the magnifying glass up to others. And we actually need to look at our own modes of interaction. And sometimes we need somebody who's a colleague to point it out to us, because we've got complacent in how we go. I think your first comment in terms of relationship, often I see in domestic violence situations, it is very intentional to wear the person down, to do everything they possibly can. And and then I know others in terms of it's a habit. It's a habit of how we are in relationship. And then I think it comes down to, if you are in mediation, or if you happen to have these individuals in the same room and they're calm enough to listen to alternative viewpoints, and you might actually be leading those conversations, it's an opportunity to think about the consequence of your behavior on others. And sometimes we're magnificent at doing this with our own families, but we don't necessarily do it with ourselves. Maybe it's because we're in survival mode, and or maybe it's because nobody's actually taught us a different way of being in relationship.
We've had another bit of a long one, so I'll just read it out as it is. They said, if self-esteem and confidence levels can impair academic performance, leading to loneliness, stress, and heighten the possibility of depression, drug use, and alcohol use, is building self-esteem a possible key to building resilience? From my own perspective, as silly as it sounds, I was never educated on how to learn knowledge. I had no understanding of learning subjects at school, no skills on memory and retrieving knowledge. My academic record was atrocious, and teachers never did anything to stop the bullying. I had no confidence and courage to stand up to the bullies and avoided school because I was no good at it. Bullies knew I was a soft target and I couldn't defend myself. Is it possible that with stronger levels of confidence, self-esteem and self-image, that regardless of what bullies do, young people would actually stand a chance to inoculate themselves against bullying and not allow it to impact their life? Bullying isn't going away anyway. Maybe we need to return focus to the individual.
I love what you've said, and I have goosebumps as I listen to your journey through school. And as a teacher, I'm sad. I'm disheartened. Saying that, I think the ecology is we need to work with individuals, and I agree with you in terms of what you're saying. I think it's about resilience, and I think the self image and the self concept also needs to be married with the self care. And I think we also need to look at, we are in relationship with others. So it's about skilling an individual. But so often I've worked with individuals over my career, and we have the most magnificent practice sessions. I'm sitting in the chair as a counsellor and I'm thinking to myself, wow, this person has got it. And it's because they've actually gone to so many counsellors. They can talk the talk, but they can't actually walk the walk. And it's by us as counsellors, we know the what do you want question is never the real question. We always burrow, and it's not what do you want, it's what do you really want. And I think for us, it is working with the individual in the areas and landscape you just talked about, but you can't do it in isolation. But if you have people who don't believe in you and they're not going to support you, then you have to look and you've got to seek, who can I reach to? We've got a concept called patron and master. And, you know, it may be that you're a master of your destiny, but you've got a patron who is there that you can reach out to and who can support. Maybe a community member, an extended family, maybe even a classmate. So it's always about relationship with, but the with must be life empowering. They can't be life draining. And so the big thing that pulls us down is the negativity. The self-esteem, it's your belief in yourself, it's your identity. You're spot on. The resilience is about how to be able to cope when the going gets tough and not get caught in a hole, but to be able to recover. But it's also about, I think, a sense of joy and a sense of meaning. So one of the books you might be familiar with is Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. It's an incredible book, and it talks about, and if you know Viktor Frankl, concentration camp, Second World War, and he talks about everything was taken away from me except my power to think. And I had control of how I would think. And I think the slide I put up with the arrow, it's about trying to understand the thinking. So you're exactly on track, but also see if you can get some companions on the journey that will help you fly with your own wings.
So just down to the last couple here. Jane has asked about codes of engagement. They would love the codes of engagement, please.
We can send those to you. So they're fabulous, and I'm thrilled about those. They were developed by a team of 6 or 7 young people, and we've got them in many schools, and we've got them in many higher education institutions. So if you just put your email address, and then we'll follow up and send that through.
So just the last question sort of related to that, somebody's asked, what will be the process for getting our hands on some of these resources after the event? So I'll organise to send everything out to everyone who's attended the event this evening, including your attendance certificates, a copy of the slides, and a link to watch the recording of the event, plus any other resources that Margaret would like to pass on to myself. And I'll share that out with everybody, and they should arrive over the next few days and before the end of the week.
Excellent.
Very good. So that is all of our questions for today. So I guess we might go ahead and wrap it up there.
Thank you, Will.
I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody for joining us online. We had about 100 people. We've still got 75 hanging out here at the very end just over 2 hours later. So I'm sure everybody found it was a really informative presentation, and it's been a great opportunity to get Margaret here and put her in front of the camera. I've been threatening to do it for quite a while now. So yeah, it's been great, even for me, just sitting here by myself watching this. And yeah, thanks very much. And we hope to see you at another ACAP Industry and Alumni event at some point in the near future. I believe there's one coming up in the next week or two on narrative therapy. So make sure to jump on our Eventbrite profile and check that out. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.